Hey Jason, welcome to Hashed. It's so good to have you.
It's great to be here in Korea with you.
Amazing. Can you tell me about where you come from, your practice, and your expertise?
Sure. So I'm a partner at Morrison Cohen in New York, a U.S. law firm, and I head up our regulatory enforcement and white collar group as well as our digital assets group.
Great. I know that you are quite active on Twitter, and it's really nice to meet you in person. Sometimes you don't get that kind of physical connectivity. So let's dive right in. So the EU has come up with its MiCA legislation. What does the landscape look like in the U.S. in general?
I think it's very fractured. So unlike what the EU is trying to do with MiCA, U.S. regulation is split across many different regulators. We've got the Securities and Exchange Commission, who looks at securities, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which looks at futures, derivatives, and the like. The Department of Justice deals with criminal activity. FinCEN, which is within the Department of Treasury, deals with money transfer. The states, all 50 states, have their own money transmission regimes as well as being active in all of these other areas as well. So it's really, really fragmented, which can be a big challenge for projects that are just starting up.
And I think because of that kind of particular reality in the states, there have been multiple frameworks that have been proposed in the U.S. to regulate crypto assets. SEC Commissioner Peirce has come up with a safe harbor exemption. The Loomis bill that has been circulating in the Senate for Agriculture has CFTC kind of being highlighted in the bill as well. What are some of the circulating drafts that you have seen, and in your opinion, which one get it right and which one doesn't?
Well, I really liked Commissioner Peirce's proposal for a 3-year safe harbor. One of the biggest problems is trying to achieve decentralization, which I think a lot of people in the space see as a goal, but is very difficult to achieve, right? People call me and say, I want to run a DAO, or I want to start a DAO, and I think to myself, okay, then it's not a DAO. It can be decentralized, but it needs to get there, and it needs time to get there. And Commissioner Peirce's proposal, which unfortunately none of the other commissioners took up, would have provided that. The Loomis-Gillibrand bill, which has recently been circulating, is, I think, another very good start. It appoints a little bit more authority in the CFTC to try to regulate crypto as commodities. It's not a perfect bill. It doesn't perfectly clarify, because there's a aspect of the bill as it's currently written that says nothing in this bill will accept crypto that is also a security. And of course, the SEC, chaired by Gary Gensler, is currently saying that pretty much all crypto is a security. So I don't see that it would resolve those tensions, but it might do a little bit more to help push them along if Congress were to enact that bill.
And you said that you particularly like the safe harbor exemption because it allows for like a temporal transition period for a project to achieve decentralization. But for me, the word sufficiently decentralized has been circulated by Chairman Hinman for a very long time, but we don't really have a legal test to measure exactly what that means. In your opinion, what is decentralization and what is sufficiently decentralized?
Well, I think we have to remember that when we're looking for sufficiently decentralized, it's for a very specific purpose. And that purpose is to satisfy the United States Howey test for what is an investment contract. You can't get through an interview with a crypto lawyer without hearing about the Howey test. But we're looking at an investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profit from the efforts of others. And the SEC has made clear in its April 2019 guidance that the others that we're looking at have to be significant players, people who are taking those essential managerial efforts, is the phrase the case law uses, to push things forward. So we know it's sufficiently decentralized when there is not a single group of people taking that essential managerial effort. But what does that mean? Because somebody has to manage the thing. So if you have someone who manages the UI, is that someone that we're all looking to make our token values go up? Probably not. So there's really a deep question about what it means to be sufficiently decentralized. Mark Boiron of DYDX just put out a great paper on what his view of sufficient decentralization means, and it's something that we in the U.S. crypto legal community have been talking about for quite some time.
Great. And let's then assume that a particular project has achieved, decentralization, and that in that case, it will probably move into the realm of commodities. And if the CFTC, according to the Loomis bill, if they do have kind of the main regulatory authority as a commodity, is that the right approach in your opinion? And what do you think is perhaps lacking or something that could be improved upon in the existing bill as it is?
I think it's the right approach, but it's also the current approach, right? It's also what we have now. So commodity, as defined in the Commodity Exchange Act, is an extraordinarily broad thing. It basically is anything. And the CFTC has the ability to regulate pretty much anything for which there are futures or derivatives. Now, not all crypto has futures and derivatives as some sort of technical matter, but a couple of judges in the US have decided that since Bitcoin has futures and Bitcoin is crypto, then crypto has futures, so the CFTC gets to regulate all of crypto. Now, it only regulates futures, derivatives, margin, etc. For trading in the spot market, the only thing the CFTC regulates is fraud. So if there's fraud selling a token, the CFTC can and does take action. But short of fraud, the CFTC has no jurisdiction. And I think the way the bill is phrased, which would continue, appropriately continue that state of affairs, but also say if a token is a security, then the SEC has jurisdiction over that token. I think what happens then is the bill doesn't do enough to make clear that the CFTC should be the regulator of first resort and not the SEC.
Interesting. Okay. So in your mind, what would be an ideal regulation that would be good enough for you?
I get to decide
Yes.
when projects are securities. No, I think that the SEC needs to revamp its thinking about the Howey test and how that works in real life. The Howey test is from 1946, right? We're using a test that came out the same year that the ENIAC computer was invented to decide when a crypto token is or isn't a security. I think it was easier to tell that in the days of paper certificates of security that were pure equity, and the paper meant nothing. All it meant was a representation of equity in a company. But as you know, now we can have tokens that represent equity in a company, but also have 100 different use cases. And I think it's inappropriate to rely on this outdated test to determine that a security that has many use cases but also might technically fit the Howey test would still be a security for any and all purposes. I think the SEC needs to refine its thinking about that rather than just trying to expand its jurisdiction. Because the problem with the SEC's thinking is that in that expansion of jurisdiction, more and more companies are staying offshore. They're saying, I don't want to be subject to the SEC. I don't want to enter the US markets. I'll stay out. And maybe for the SEC, that's fine because they get to protect American markets. But the downside of that is, I come here to Seoul and I see 100 amazing projects targeting the Korean market. And I think, when are these folks going to come to the US? And the answer is, under the current regime, they might not. Because if they can't be either sufficiently decentralized or get sufficient comfort that they're not going to run afoul of the SEC, then the US market can be risky for them. So it makes sense to have this development happen abroad, which hurts American competitiveness.
Interesting. Then, in light of your opinion, what do you think of the SEC's recent actions, especially the Wahi case with the Coinbase insider trading case? I think they are taking a rather aggressive position on expanding the jurisdiction, as you've rightly pointed out. If this case were to proceed, and there's potentially a judgment saying that this was an insider trading, what does it mean for the industry, and what are some consequences that we would really need to be watching out for?
So first of all, one of the phrases you said in there is "if it were to proceed," and let me just pause on that for a moment because I think it illustrates the danger of the SEC's bringing this case in the way they have. The Wahi case was brought as a companion case to a Department of Justice criminal indictment, and when you have multiple cases like that, the vast majority of the time, the SEC case will be stayed in favor of the criminal case, and the vast majority of criminal cases get solved with pleas. The vast majority of criminal cases that are paired with SEC and plead out have the SEC come in and reach a package deal. So while all of that is not guaranteed to happen, anything could happen, the cases could go forward. The most likely outcome here is that the defendants plead and that plea resolves the SEC matter as well. If that's the case, then the SEC will have made these allegations about these projects completely unfairly without the projects being involved at all, which creates all sorts of negative externalities, terrible effects for the projects without giving them a chance to respond, and in a case that will likely never go forward for a full hearing on the facts. So I think that what the SEC has done here is very aggressive and, in my view, very unfair. But that's the question of if it goes forward, if it doesn't go forward. If it did go forward and the SEC did go forward on this case, it's a tough situation because Wahi and the other defendants, they don't have access to the information from these projects to prove that these projects are not securities. So what we would be looking at is the SEC and the defendants sending third-party subpoenas to all of these projects and essentially playing out an SEC investigation in the courtroom while the projects are not actually parties to the case. So it's a very awkward way for the SEC to do this. A lot of us have been criticizing the SEC for regulation by enforcement. This, in my view, is even worse. It's regulation by enforcement against other people.
I think that's something really we need to look out for, and I think we look forward to getting more input. And I think as the case develops, I will be making sure to read your Twitter and your opinions on the matter. So in light of your expertise, especially in litigation, I think this is an important case that we need to be watching out now. But historically speaking, what have been some important cases that are worth noting in the industry, and what are some of the lessons that portfolio companies now can learn from your experience?
So a lot of the important cases are either the big cases that are currently going on, like the Ripple case. There are also a pretty steady flow of lower level cases, little garden variety frauds. And although none of these are particularly notable, it is an important lesson for people. The most important thing that projects can do is don't commit fraud, right? Play it straight. And that goes for more than just, don't lie to people. That's kind of obvious. But, no fraud by omission, no misleading, no saying things that make it sound this way when really the truth is the other way and they're not telling you that. So the most important thing, don't commit fraud. Sounds pretty easy, but sometimes can actually be trickier because it demands that you make disclosures in a certain way about your product. And for people who are not used to the U.S. disclosure regime, it can be something unusual to deal with.
Okay. And speaking of the U.S. disclosure regime, could you lightly touch upon some of the details so that our audience knows what those are?
So if you are a security, and of course that's a big if, you have certain disclosure requirements, and those requirements vary based on whether you are fully registering that security, which requires many disclosure requirements, or even if you're going for one of the exemptions, you have some disclosure requirements, more if you are targeting retail, and less if you're targeting only experienced institutional investors or accredited investors. That said, you have to meet whatever disclosure requirements there are, generally giving a full, fair picture about your project, what it is, what you intend to do. And again, you have to avoid fraud by omission, which means, if you're saying some things, but there are other facts that would make the things that you did say really untrue, you have a duty to say those facts as well. So it's important for projects, I say this in a self-serving way perhaps, to hire a good lawyer, me, someone else, doesn't matter, hire a good lawyer and just review what you're doing if you're dealing with the US markets, because the regime there is potentially somewhat different than it is in other places around the world, and our SEC is not very forgiving.
Yeah. So in terms of kind of developing best practice that you would recommend for portfolio companies, what are some of the main principles? Of course, avoid fraud is kind of like a good principle to put forward, but what are some internal compliance policies that portfolio companies can institute, and what are some of the good best practices that you would recommend?
Right. Well, first and foremost, since you mentioned the Wahi case, I think projects need to have rules about insider trading at their own projects. Coinbase was also named in that case, not as a defendant, they're not in the case, but one of the defendants worked at Coinbase. So of course, Coinbase, its name is all over that, and no project wants their name all over an SEC complaint, even if they're not the ones being named. You don't want your employees being named. You want to protect your employees. And a lot of us get into this space, because we're kind of degens, like we like trading tokens. But people who are working at a project have to be very careful about trading the tokens of their project, trading tokens of other projects where their friends work, where they're getting insider information. So this is one of the key things that all projects should think about, is having an insider trading policy. There are plenty of other policies that people should think about as well. And anti-money laundering. It's one of the key problems in the area, right? If crypto can be money and you can move it around freely everywhere, so normal people can, but bad guys can as well. And people have to make sure that they're not helping bad guys move money around, because that's something that it's not the SEC, but the Department of Justice and FinCEN can take exception to. The SEC is just a civil agency. They don't carry guns or handcuffs. They can't throw you in jail, but the Department of Justice can. So we don't want to mess with them.
For sure. Okay, well, those are the questions that I have, and thank you for your insights. Before we end the interview, I would like to know if there is a particular wisdom that you have learned over the years of your practice that you would like to share with our audience. So as a kind of like a last parting thought from you.
I think everything that's been done has been done before in some way. We're all doing very new things in this space, and that's why we're here. It's new, it's exciting, it's interesting. But it helps people to understand where we've come from, what the history is. If you're creating DAOs and trying to structure them in a way that balances efficiency and democracy, these are lessons that we've been learning for 400 years in corporate law. If you're trying to figure out how to protect investors and retail while at the same time be able to raise money, this is a regime we've had in the US for 90 years. Other countries have had similar regimes. Sometimes I feel like we're all kind of speed running the last 400 years of corporate law and finance. And I get clients who are coming to me young, full of energy, who want to do something that's basically the exact same thing that we did 10 years, 20 years, 50 years ago, but they want to tokenize it. And I love the energy, and it's great, and there are a lot of things that we should do in a tokenized fashion. But there are also a lot of things that were absolutely flaming disasters, and tokenizing it's not going to help that. So I think learning from history and thinking deeply about not just the crypto aspects of what we're trying to do, but what's the meat of what we're trying to do. Has this been done before? How has it worked, and how has it failed? And what lessons can we take from that failure to build a good, solid foundation for a company? Then we can tokenize it.
Sounds good. So hopefully the future is going to be brighter from now on, and hopefully US comes up with a little bit more regulatory clarity. And I look forward to seeing you as we mature in the industry together.
Absolutely.
Thanks
it's
for
great
your
to
time.
be here. Thanks.
Amazing.